Hello, and welcome to my kitchen. I think it was when I was reading Zora Neale Thurston that I first heard the phrase kitchen table history. And I'm sitting here at my kitchen table today thinking about the history of my family that I learned while sitting around a kitchen table. My favorite memories were of going to Chicago, and my grandmother and my aunts and my uncles and my dad and my mom would sit around the table talking about memories from when my aunts and uncles were kids. And I remember the laughter, and I remember the smell of coffee and the bakery, because Grandma would always go down to the bakery, get a bunch of different kind of kuchens, and she would cut them up into sample sizes so that everyone could have a small piece to taste. And I remember the laughter, and I remember sometimes joining in, even though I didn't necessarily understand the story, but it just made me feel so much a part of the family. Now there's another facet to kitchen table history, and it's the history of the food that reminds me of my parents and my grandparents and my friends and my family. Now, I'm going to share with you some of my most precious possessions. I have 3 card files that were my mom's. They're somewhat the worse for the wear because they survived a house fire. These contain not only recipes, but the recipes each have a memory and a story that go with them. And I'd like to share a few of them with you today. The first one, my great-grandmother Murak's babka recipe. Now, babka is a Polish Easter bread that's very yeasty, it's very sweet, and it's just amazing stuff. And it's usually made at Easter time. Now, this particular recipe card was a concession to my mother, who wanted my grandmother's recipe. And my grandma said, well, you know, I always cook with throwing things together. This is great-grandma's, this should do. So one year we went to Chicago for Easter, and I remember sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table watching my mother make my grandmother put the various ingredients into measuring cups and measuring spoons, because my grandma was like, oh, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, you know, yeah, this looks like about right. So my mom got the recipe, or so she thought. Unfortunately, as is the case with people that do the kind of cooking where they just do it by feel rather than by actual measurement, never quite what Grandma's was, but it did come close. So the second thing I want to show you is my most prized recipe, my Grandpa Langford's bread recipe. Now, Grandpa always made this bread for Thanksgiving, for Easter, for Christmas, and I remember it coming out of the oven and the smell while it was baking, and when you cut into it, that steam rising, and then you'd slather it with butter and watch the butter melt, and the taste of it. There is nothing like my grandpa's bread. I'm not kidding you. I have never found a recipe that came close. He had always kept this recipe secret, but in the few years before he died, he wrote it out and gave it to a bunch of people. So I have a copy. Now, my grandmother, Langford, used to make a cake for holidays and sometimes for birthdays. It was her famous tomato soup cake. Tomato soup? Yeah, I don't know about that. But it is so good. The tomato gives it a different kind of sweetness than a lot of the sugars do. And just always remember her bringing it out in the little 9x9 pan with a little bit of icing on top of it, setting it on the table, dig in. Now, we made an improvement on it in our house. My neighbor Jean had her ice cream icing recipe. Put those two together, the best. Now, we have a big tradition in our house every Christmas of making Christmas cookies for my sister. She moved down to Florida some 30-odd years ago and said that since she's been down there, her cookies don't always turn out because probably the humidity, maybe the heat. So my kids and I and Steve get together and we make a kabillion dozen cookies and we pack them up and send them down to Florida. Now, out of this has come some traditions that I'm going to pass on to you to maybe make your cookies come out better. First of all, when you're going to make cookies, you have to take a bit of powdered sugar and make a smooch on your nose with it, because if you don't, the cookies won't turn out. And when you make butter horns, they're kind of a crescent roll type cookie. When you cut it with a pizza cutter, you have to go, hi-ya, or the cookie won't turn out, guaranteed. Now, I had a house fire in 2005, and my sister called and she said, oh, I'm so glad you guys are all okay. And she goes, but did the cookie recipes survive? I said, yeah, they did. She goes, oh, whew. And I said, yeah, me too. And since that time, she has a copy and I have a copy, so there's always one around somewhere. Now, one of my favorite kitchen table cooking things with my mom was her sweet yeast dough recipe. And this is one of those recipes that it's very versatile. You can use it for bread, you can use it for dinner rolls, you can use it for nut rolls, you can use it for kuchens, you can use it anything you need a bread base, that works. And my favorite thing that we used to make were the birdie rolls. And the birdie rolls are where you take a piece of dough and you roll them into a long tube. You tie it in a loose knot. The top one you pinch to make like a little bird beak, and the bottom you smash a little bit and you make little cuts in it so it looks like a bird's tail. We used to do a lot of baking with my mom, and that was a lot of happy times. Now, this is our neighbor Jean's death by chocolate cake recipe. Jean was such a sweet lady. She was our neighbor when I was growing up. She had all boys, so anytime she wanted to bake, she'd come knocking at the door and ask either if I would want to come down or my sister would want to come down and help her with the baking. And she always made a lot of stuff with chocolate. Oh my God, it was so good. And the best part was we always got to bring home some of what we made. It was always amazing. Now, I have lots of good memories with my kids making monkey bread. And monkey bread's basically you just take a bread dough recipe, roll out the bread, and you cut it in little cubes, you dredge it in melted butter, a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of sugar, and then you put it in the bread pan and let it just bake like normal. And it pulls apart really easily. It's fun to eat. And they always helped, but they never liked the mixing part because that was always too hard to stir the dough for them. They were younger then. And so what they would do is kneading the dough. They loved that part. So I would divide the dough into two pieces, give one to my son, one to my daughter. Now, my son was one of those who was always like, oh yeah, knead the dough, poke, poke, punch, 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 stretch it, punch it, punch it. And then my daughter was one of those, let's take the dough, stretch it, fold it, poke, 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 stretch it, fold it, poke, poke, poke. So what I do is after a few minutes, they'd switch. And the bread dough always came out beautifully because they both had a hand in it. Now, when my partner Steve and I first got together, we decided that we both love cooking, and over the years we've kind of accumulated our favorites. Most of them are online recipes that we've tweaked to our taste. We have our chicken and chorizo stew. We have Cousin Tracy's Cincinnati chili. We have a great from scratch spaghetti sauce, and of course the turkey meatloaf that we bring to the potlucks. Now, when we make the meatloaf, Steve is my sous chef. He's the one that chops everything up into the little tiny pieces that go into the meatloaf. And one day I said, thank you for being my sous chef. He goes, my name is Steve, not Sue. So I said, so you're my Steve chef. So anytime that you have the meatloaf at a potluck, don't forget to thank Steve for being the Steve chef. Now, I have two cookbooks that I really love too. this one is from the parish that I grew up in, and it's full of wonderful kind of home cooking kind of recipes. Some are a little strange, like made with canned everything, but others are just incredible. And this one, Here's What's Cooking, was from a group my mom used to belong to. And I think that why I love these so much is that I look at the recipes and I remember the people that made this food. And I remember seeing the food at the potlucks and at gatherings and on the tables when we went to visit family and friends. And I remember the tastes and the smells and the goodness of the food, and particularly the warmth of the friendship of just being together with these people. Gave me a lot of good memories. So, maybe during this time of quarantine, why don't you go on the internet or pull out a cookbook and make some kitchen table history with your own family. Stay safe, stay healthy, enjoy.